Hi everyone, so we are now on lesson number 9 on the Concerto Through Time, and lesson number 8 we looked at the Romantic period, and we covered everything really with regards how the Romantic aesthetic affected musical features in the concerto. Today's learning points are actually more general, but we are going to use Romantic examples just so we keep listening and familiarising ourselves with the Romantic period a little bit more. So learning point number 1 is going to be, what were movements in concertos? What does that mean as a term, and what did they look like? And then the second learning point is going to be the Italian words, the terminology that we need to be able to use regarding concertos. And that's throughout all three. So movements and Italian terminology in the Baroque, the Classical and the Romantic, but we'll use the Romantic for examples to sort of help consolidate that understanding. And the Italian terms that we need to look at, I'm going to focus on tempo markings and terms that describe tempo, and that in turn is also relevant to movements, but we will also look at some other relevant terminology as well. And then the second part of the video, after we've examined that and we've had a case study on another Romantic concerto, I'm going to do a little bit of an assessment with you, and you'll have some questions to answer, because we just, now that we've sort of finished covering all the contextual information, we need to really build up your understanding of how to orally recognise those three different genres, and then within those be able to orally recognise and understand and explain what's going on musically depending on the extract that you're listening to. Okay, so with regards our first learning point and movements, a movement is a self-contained part of a musical composition or a musical form. So you can have an individual or selected movement from a composition performed on its own. However, in a sort of formal performance scenario of the complete work, it requires you to have each movement played in the correct order, one after the other, and that is considered a full performance, so they're performed in succession. And there are different rules for different types of composition, different types of work, as to how many movements they have. Those rules really came into sort of stricter force in the classical period, because as we know, the aesthetic with classicism was all about form and structure, and you had quite rigid sets of rules about how you did things. And in the classical period, it was really established that a concerto would have 3 movements. So Baroque concertos often did also have 3 movements, but in the classical period, it just became a bit more sort of imposed. And in the Romantic period, you continued to have 3 movements in a concerto. Occasionally, particularly later Romantic composers, they started pushing the boundaries a bit and they started having 4 movements, so developing things a bit more. The symphony, on the other hand, so a symphony is a composition that is for a complete orchestra. You don't have a soloist at the front. A symphony has always had 4 movements. So you might have heard in the past someone talking about, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, third movement, for example. And that's what they're talking about. They're talking about a self-contained piece within the whole performance piece. But we don't need to worry about symphonies. We just need to worry about concertos. And you need to remember 3 movements. And those movements had special characteristics. So for the concerto, the first movement would always be fast. The second movement would always be slow and lyrical, and the third movement, again, would be fast. The most detail you're going to have to go in on this would be having a question, and let's say it's slow and it's a concerto. You might get asked, what movement is this extract likely to have come from? And so the answer, if it's slow, would be the second movement. Obviously, if it's got a brisk pace, if it's fast moving, then the correct answer would be either the first or the third movement. And there isn't a way to differentiate between them, so either of those answers would be accepted as correct. The other thing you need to know about, and again, not in a huge amount of detail, is the typical structures that were used. So the first movement of a concerto almost always was in sonata form. And sonata form, we looked at that when we looked at structures in a previous video, sonata form is basically ternary form. So you've got a section, then a contrasting section in the middle, and then the opening section returns. But what makes sonata form a bit more complex than just ternary form is that your opening section actually has two themes. Then you have a development in the middle, which is contrasting, and then you have the return of your two themes at the end, and there is a key change. But it's basically an elaborate version of ternary form, and that would always be applied to the first movement. The second movement might be ternary form. It also might be theme and variations, and we looked at those. And then the third movement was more varied. It could be a rondo, it might be theme and variations, or it might be sonata form again. So you could get a question saying the first movement from a concerto, and you've got other things that you need to answer, and then it might say suggest what the overall structure of this movement would be. And because they've told you it's the first movement, your answer would be sonata form. So moving on to our second learning point, which ties in with this, it's the Italian terminology that we need to be able to apply when analysing music. And generally, most publishing houses that are printing Western classical music use Italian terms in the majority. Sometimes if you have a composer who is not Italian and has not used Italian terms originally, publishing houses do keep the alternative language terms. So German you see quite a lot, French you see quite a lot as well. But generally speaking, the Italian musical terms became a sort of musical language across Europe. So it didn't matter if you didn't speak Italian as a musician, as a conductor, as a composer, you had to be familiar with the terminology in Italian, and that was what was most prevalently used. So the ones that you need to know are on the screen right now. You've got presto, allegro, moderato, andante, adagio, and largo. There are many, many more, and those of you that have done theory, you've done grade 5 theory, for example, you will have had to learn a lot more, and not just Italian ones. But for the purposes of GCSE, you need to have a term for something that is very fast, so we use presto, and for something that is fast, and we use allegro, and that's fine. Moderato is moderate, that's an easy one to remember. Andante is a walking pace. That's quite important because sometimes if you have music that is obviously meant to be marched to or walked to, it's andante, and that sort of makes sense. Adagio means slow, but largo is the slowest and also tends to be a kind of solemn slowness. So it's, yes, those terms describe the tempo, so how many beats per minute, and you've got the beats per minute markings, the BPM figures on the right hand column, but also they're kind of used slightly differently depending on the style. So largo would be used for something that is very solemn sounding. Adagio tended to be used for pieces of music that are very beautiful and slow and gentle sounding. So the Italian terms for tempo do also slightly cross over into the style of the piece itself. So for those, you just need to memorise them. You need to memorise it as though you were learning vocabulary for French or whatever language you take, or learning terms in science. You know, you just have to learn them if you don't know them already. And you might well be asked to give a suggested tempo marking, tempo term for an extract that you've heard, and you would have to decide whether it was fast enough to be given allegro or whether it was really fast, presto. Is it in the middle? Is it slow? What's the most appropriate word to use? The other terms that you need to be familiar with are those relating to dynamics. So you hopefully have heard of some of these, that piano, so it's not piano like the instrument, but piano means quiet or soft, and forte means loud. And if you put a mezzo before either of those symbols, it means slightly or moderately. So in terms of quiet to loud, you would have piano, then you would have mezzo piano, then you would have mezzo forte, then you would have forte. You can also see that you've got some more extreme dynamics which were starting to come in towards the end of the classical period. So you've got pianissimo, which is a double P, and that's very soft. You've got fortissimo, which is a double F, which is very loud. In the Romantic period, when things really got going and dynamics were obviously being used to create drama and expression, you could actually have up to 6 Fs. So you could have F, 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 meaning just play the instrument as loud as you possibly humanly can. And similarly, you could go down to 6 lots of Ps. So pia, 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 pianissimo, whatever it is. You'd never have to say it out loud, obviously, but the composer would just put tons of Ps, basically be as soft as possible. You've got some other ones which are less common, which have not yet come up on OCR before, but they do sometimes throw in new things, and it's fairly easy to understand what these mean. So forte piano is literally, as it looks, it's loud followed by quiet. So you would play something loudly but then immediately quietly afterwards, and that's obviously quite expressive and dramatic doing that, and so that could well come up in the Romantic period. And sforzando, which is abbreviated to SFZ, is a sudden accent, so a suddenly loud note. Accents can also be marked with lines over the top of the notes or little hairpins, little sideways arrows on top of a singular note, and that means that you accent that particular note. But I don't think you would ever have to write that or mark that. You might have to orally appraise that the music is accented, and we know that that happens a lot in the Romantic period to be dramatic. Underneath there, you've got your gradually changing dynamic symbols, and it's a crescendo gradually getting louder and a diminuendo gradually getting softer. And when you've got these one after the other, so your crescendo and then diminuendo, crescendo and then diminuendo, so you're getting gradually louder and then quieter again, and it's quite a subtle change, that is known as a dynamic swell. So the music is sort of swelling, getting louder and quieter very gradually. And you could have those extreme changes, those extreme accents or sforzandos, sudden change to, triple P, very, very quiet music, and then suddenly triple F or quadruple F or whatever, suddenly loud. But you could also have these more subtle variations and changes, whatever worked for the theme of the piece, whatever made it sound the most expressive or dramatic. You do have some other words that you have already come across that hopefully have sunk in. So in the Baroque period, you have got ritornello form. So tutti, meaning all. Ritornello, which is the little return, so the ritornello section within ritornello form. You already know those words. Basso continuo, so that is Italian as well. So the use of a basso continuo and all of that is using an Italian term. You've also got Alberti bass. So Alberti, that's the Italian word, was the specific type of bass line in the classical period. You also need to be familiar with a rallentando or ritardando, which can be abbreviated to ral with a dot or rit with a dot, and that means you slow down gradually. And accelerando, or just ACC with a dot, which means you speed up, you accelerate, and we've covered those in a previous video. And finally, we've also talked about rubato, meaning when you bend the tempo and you sort of pull it back or you push it forwards in terms of moving with the sort of flow of expression. And also our general terminology for concerto, so the word concerto in itself is Italian. You've obviously got concerto grosso, which is the big concerto, meaning it's the one with the big group or the group of soloists, and then within that you've got the concertino, which is their specific name, and the ripieno accompanying orchestra. You also have terms that we've been using for a while now to describe playing techniques. So for string instruments, you've got pizzicato, or just pizz, which means that you are plucking the strings with your finger. And the opposite of that is arco, when you are bowing. So you wouldn't write arco on music that was just meant to be bowed all the way through. But if you did write pizzicato because there was a section where you wanted the string players to pluck, you would then write arco to tell them to go back to using their bows. So it's assumed you'd be using your bows in the first place, but if they've had a pitch section, then you have to put arco to tell them to go back. We know about glissandos, which you can have on a string instrument, because we also can have them on guitars in pop music, where you are doing a big slide up a string or down a string. We've got vibrato, which is when you are wobbling or vibrating the sound so that it has a more sort of resonant ringing tone. And you do that in different ways. On string instruments, you wiggle your finger that is pressing down the string. On wind and brass instruments, you use your diaphragm to vibrate the air as it goes through. And finally, we've got legato and staccato, which we've been using for years, really. Hopefully you know those two. So legato meaning it's smooth and joined up, and staccato meaning your notes are jumpy and are released very quickly. Okay, so as promised, I'm going to use a romantic concerto as an example so we can sort of contextualise these new terms and the concept of movement. And the one I've chosen is one that is a favourite of mine. It is Mendelssohn's Violin Concerto in E minor. So as I explained, in the Romantic period, almost completely exclusively, the instruments that you would have as your soloist were pianos, violins or cellos. And we've obviously in the previous video seen a piano soloist, and so this one is a violin. And violins were definitely the most popular of the three, so lots and lots of violin concertos were written. Mendelssohn is an interesting composer. He's an early Romantic composer. He's generally considered to be the next great composer after Beethoven. He definitely did adopt Romantic principles in his music. He created a lot of drama, and certainly he created a lot of emotion. So this concerto in particular is very emotive, it's very expressive and beautiful. And when it's played well, which it definitely is by he's a world famous violinist called Ray Chen, it's really, really beautiful and poignant. But yet he also did keep some things quite conservative, so he didn't push the boundaries of harmony too much. His harmonies weren't overly chromatic. He still stuck to sort of reasonably well formed and balanced structures. So his melodies were very long. He didn't have balanced phrasing as such, so he would have long, lyrical, endless melodies that were very expressive. He played around a lot with tempo and rubato. He played around a lot with pitch and dynamic, but just other principles of his writing didn't push the boundaries too far. So he's a good example of an early Romantic composer. And as we listen to this example, I'm just going to dip in and out and just pinpoint certain parts and do a bit of analysis with you, just so you get an idea of how and when you should be using the Italian terminology. So that's a really good example there of the typically Romantic feature, where you've got instruments within the orchestra who are having quite prominent solos. So there's a clarinet duet going on there and some flutes as well. So this is a really good example of the use of vibrato to make the notes sound ringing and beautiful. And we've got a piano dynamic. Got a dynamic swell, so a crescendo. And a gentle bit of rubato there as he just came over the top of the phrase. He pulled it back slightly. But if you think how many instruments there are on that stage, every individual instrument in the orchestra is having to play exceptionally quietly in order that that one violin really stands out over the top, and yet he's also still playing quite quietly. So that's an extreme of pitch there. With a little turn, so there's still some ornamentation in the melodies. And see how there's been a little accelerando there, so the tempo has really pushed forwards. And the pulse is faster, but what makes it seem even more sort of energised is the fact that the violin solo has now got a much greater frequency of notes within each beat of the pulse. So it's not a ridiculously increased pulse overall, but the frequency of notes makes it sound much more dramatic. And also the dynamics have increased, so there's been a general crescendo. We've got pizzicato with lower strings. Whole orchestra doing a trill forte. There's a timpani roll with them. And it's coming down again in dynamic. And listen to that pizzicato in the lower strings. So those really light, plucked notes. So again, lots of shifting moods, tempo pulling faster and slower. A crescendo. Key change, it's modulated to the major, it's quite dramatic sounding. Really pulling the tempo back. So a real ritardando or rallentando there. So the technical tempo that was given to this movement, the first movement of the concerto, was allegro molto appassionato. And for GCSE you don't need to know those additional words. So molto appassionato, you might be able to guess, means with much passion. And it's allegro. So generally this is seen as a fast movement, which certainly it is at the moment, but there have been moments where it's slowed quite a lot, but still overall this is an allegro pulse. And he is demonstrating the molto appassionato at this point. But you won't have to use any of those descriptive words for how it's playing, you just need to know the tempo terms. And this is, of course, a cadenza. So the entire orchestra has stopped. The conductor has actually got his hands in front of him, like he's got his baton down. The violinist is completely on his own, and he's directing the music himself. Got trills there. Double stopping. That's using a harmonic. So you can do harmonics on string instruments, where it's creating an even higher pitch than you would normally be able to achieve. It's getting more agitated and frenetic. That's another harmonic. See how he achieves the vibrato when he sort of wiggles his finger on the string. And this has got a very fluid tempo. The pulse is moving frequently in this. The is just going to come back in, and that's the theme that's returned. So this is now actually the second movement of the concerto. What they started doing in the Romantic period was stopping having a full pause between movements. So they moved very quickly. There was a very quick transition from one movement to the next. And the only reason for this was to stop the audience clapping in between, because it's not the done thing to clap after each movement. You wait until the end of the full piece, the end of the concerto. So they've moved very quickly into the middle movement, which is slower. This is an adagio tempo marking, and just listen to how beautiful it is.